Hello and welcome to the wonderful world of Innova, alive and composing with today's guest, Larry Moss. Hello, Larry. Would you state your name for the record?
Uh, Larry, this is Larry Moss, and I'm officially Lawrence, but I always go by Larry, so that's right.
Great. Now, I understand that there may be a horse chestnut tree behind you. Do you have any special stories about that horse chestnut, and would you know how to play conkers if I asked you to?
I don't know anything about horse chestnuts except that they have a very distinctive leaf. And what was the second part of your question?
Well, there's the British schoolboys game of conkers where you take the nuts from the horse chestnut, you attach them with a piece of string, and you go around trying to smash your fellow boys' conker, gaining points along the way. It's a whole lot of fun.
That sounds like fun. I hope I'm not too old at 84 to try that. I'd never heard of it though. I don't think it
School
made
children
it
probably
across
employ more sophisticated weapons these days.
Yeah, that's right. That's more the American style.
Now, looking at you, I can't decide if you're a cat or a dog kind of composer. I'm thinking maybe both. Is that right?
That's probably correct. Presently, I'm a cat composer because we've always had dogs, and the last one died at a ripe old age of 13, 14, something like that. And we had a couple of kittens who have grown now into mature cats, and so I thought I'd change, I guess it's like a sexual change or whatever. But then I visited my daughter in Alaska just a couple of weeks ago, and she has a real dog. It's a puppy, but it's a Bernese mountain dog, and it's not fully grown yet, and it's not fully grown, and it weighs 120 pounds right now. And so that's a lot of dog, and I found my old dog-loving tendencies blossomed again. So I'm a lover of both cats and dogs at this point.
You seem to be quite a continental globetrotter because you're down in Maryland much of the time, is that right? And yet your reach extends to Alaska. Do you have a favorite kind of climate and environment that really suits your temperament?
Oh, yeah. At this time of year, it is definitely Alaska. It was in the 90s, approaching 100 when we left, and it was the highest in Alaska. This is Homer, Alaska, right on the Gulf, so it's a little bit milder, certainly mild. Well, it's milder in every way than the interior, like Fairbanks. So it was 65. Wonderful weather, sunny weather, and just what we would hope for, but almost never get in Washington in the spring. And by the way, before that, I was down in Mexico City. There was I don't think you know about this. I was invited to give what they call a conferencia at an international forum that's been going on for about 30 years, I gather, and it's a month-long celebration, reminding me very much of the Warsaw Autumn, which I was at a few years ago, where the whole city is involved, and they give this series of concerts for about a month. Only the Mexican wrinkle is there is a serious paper you give or talk, which I did, and then they play your music. It was very nice, and the audiences are very enthusiastic. So, I'd never been that far south, so that was kind of nice. And
Do
it
you
was
find
raining.
that your music is suitable to a certain part of the world, or I assume it's been performed internationally, and do you find that your music is, well regarded in Darmstadt or in Taipei or Mexico City?
I would say it's much
does it
better
match a certain kind
regarded
of temperament?
Probably much better regarded in Mexico City, and I think there's a reason for that. I think in Darmstadt they're always interested in the latest stuff, and I'm not sure that mine is the latest stuff. I think Robert Kraft, way back when he was going there with Stravinsky, wrote a piece for Perspectives of New Music called The Diors of Darmstadt, which was that every year brought in a new fashion. This is, of course, when Boulez and Stockhausen were running the place, and it was a very lively spot where I think the main thrust would have been whatever was new, the cutting edge of new music. And I suspect it's still that way, but I haven't been back there for a long time. I was there in the 60s, actually, and that was the last time. And Mexico City is an area which I'd never been to, and it survives as they love music. The concerts were extremely well attended, and they have a huge range. And I was, with my music, probably, certainly I was the one, a foreigner there. The younger Mexican composers all were doing pretty much what younger composers do in America, following rock and minimalism, John Adams, Steve Reich, Jerry Riley, this sort of thing. And there was quite a contrast. And what surprised me was that the audience liked my stuff. It was a definite contrast of what else was going on.
Tell me a bit about the trajectory of your compositional pathways and evolution. What was your first sound memory?
Well, my first sound memory this is a story my mom used to tell me. I may have told it to you before, but I'll repeat it. It's before I can remember, but it was I was something like 4 years old, and I wasn't playing the piano yet, but I was listening to my dad's wonderful collection of Brahms. He was a great Brahms lover. He loved Brahms and Sibelius for whatever reason, and we had a lot of these old 78s. And I remember my mom said that it was bedtime, and I looked at her ferociously, like, how dare you interrupt me? It turns out I was listening to the Brahms Fourth Symphony. So she thought then and there I might have intimations of becoming a composer.
And would it be true to say that you grew up in the Teutonic system of that era?
Yes, I think I grew up in L.A. and there were, of course, two great composers living there at the same time, Stravinsky and Schoenberg. And you had to take sides in those days. And my teachers, well, it's rather interesting. I had teachers from both sides. My main teacher was Leon Kirshner, who recently passed away, and he himself had studied in Schoenberg's class at UCLA. But before then, I'd studied privately with Leonard Stein, who was Schoenberg's, I guess you could call him his factotum, his Schindler to Beethoven, and. So I absorbed that school. I never really composed too much in 12-tone, in fact, almost none. But that was Schoenberg's way, too, because he didn't really want to teach it. As you know, his students learned it on their own. He didn't teach 12-tone. So I grew up very much in that Teutonic world, thinking of Beethoven, Brahms, Bach, all of them, the great men that they were, and that was my whole world. And then, much later, I discovered Debussy and Varese. And of course, Varese is at least as much American as French, but I discovered another way of looking at music, also Chopin. And so I'd like to think that what I do now reflects those traditions too.
And in Los Angeles, did you have any interest or repulsion against the film industry and the film music? Did you have an interest in writing for that?
That's interesting. There were people who thought it would be a natural. My dad was a lawyer and knew some of these people, but I had that classic sort of Schoenbergian, well, he did contempt for this sort of thing, although you know there is that great story about a conversation, real or not, between him and Sam Goldwyn for writing the track for, what was it, the Pearl Buck, the Good Earth, or whatever. You know that story? It's actually a very funny story. It may be true. Evidently, Goldberg wanted him for just whatever, I guess, give a kind of intellectual veneer to his stuff, and he was pointing out, this story runs that he was pointing out to Schoenberg all the great things that were happening at the film. At one point, as I recall, you have the heroine in the middle of a field, which is, you see the horde of locusts over the horizon, and of course the field is parched by a famine, and as if that weren't enough, she's about to give birth to a baby, and the story goes that he waited for Schoenberg's reaction, and it came after a little bit in a very quiet voice, something to the effect that, with all that going on, Mr. Goldwyn, why would you need music? So anyway, that was I like that story, but I never really thought of writing for films.
Is there anything you learned from your teachers and your mentors that you like to pass on to your own students? And do you have any words of wisdom for the next generation?
Well, I was very much influenced by Leon Kirshner's approach in many ways, both positively and negatively. He was a marvelous pianist. He was a marvelous personality. He was very charismatic. And he had a way of approaching music as a living thing. He would sit down and just play stuff. And actually, I owed my first job to him. I was teaching under him at Mills College. I was handling the theory courses, which he didn't want to be bothered with. So, and I was living not far from him, and I couldn't say that I watched while he was composing, but I would see his stuff in the process of being composed, and he would work on a large board, and like a typical like a typical improviser, which he was brilliant at. He would have little stretches, little scratches of music, all notated in little scraps of paper, all on this big board, just aligned in a sort of a mosaic. And he would pick through it as he played. And I thought this was really great, but also I rebelled very much at it because I was basically just the opposite temperament. I wanted to see where things led. And that's actually the way he taught too. When he looked at Beethoven, we looked at that famous first sonata, which Schoenberg also looked at with his students. And the beauty of that is you see a new mind working, a mind which starts out with sonata form like everybody, but then you see Beethoven processing it in his own way, one idea to another. How do you propel it forward? How do you grip the listener in this kind of vice that Beethoven is so adept at, where whether you like it or not, you're propelled along just along the tracks he wants you to go on. And that was that powerful Beethoven model which I absorbed. I certainly started getting from Kirchner, although that's not the way I think he wrote himself, but somehow he ignited that spark in me. So I give him great credit for that. We were very different in temperament. I admired greatly his virtuosity. I think he may have had a little possible envy of my more orderly process, which was not his.
What kind of time period are we talking about now?
Oh, we're talking about when I was a student. Specifically, I was working for my doctorate at USC, which would be let's see, I got out of the Army in 53, so I started, excuse me, this would be when I was working on with him between 1951 and 1953. And then I went to Vienna on a Fulbright, and then to the Army, and then finally ended up at Mills, 1956.
Right, so you have a special perspective on 20th century music and 21st century now. So what have you observed about how the field has changed? Because it seems since the 50s, we're no longer given the choice between Stravinsky or Schoenberg or a couple of other things, but there's a whole wide range of options out there. Are there some that you embrace and some that you simply don't understand and wish would go away?
Well, I think it's very interesting. Just before I went to Mexico City, I read a classic book, Thomas Kuhn's, The Nature of Scientific Revolutions. I think he coined the phrase paradigmatic shift, which is a big word, a big buzzword in scientific circles. He had the idea, which I think is very true in science, that there are basically dominant ways of looking at nature, which he calls paradigms, which simply encompass all what is regarded as science of the time, but they're always preceded by a breakup of a previous one, and he gives all kinds of examples like the Copernican revolution, and I think the birth of chemistry with Lavoisier, and of course Einstein's the birth of quantum physics after Einstein. And each of these is kind of a murky period when it starts, where everything is floating around, and even some of the great people who usher in the new era, like Priestley, who made it possible for the discovery of oxygen. According to him, this is stuff I've long since forgotten. Lavoisier, the great talent around the time of the Revolution, who was also consumed by it, but that's another story. Anyway, that Priestley, although he made it possible, went to his grave without ever really still believing in phlogiston, which is a buzzword, which nobody even knows what it means anymore, but it was the dominant theory, and I guess whenever that was, the early 18th century. So I think has parallels in music, except there was certainly the German strain was obviously dominant in the 19th century, no question of that. Then it sort of bifurcated with Wagner, the new German music, which was going to lead to Strauss, of course, and in a sense to Mahler. And then there were the old, I won't use the word I was about to use because it wouldn't be suitable, but the old people like Brahms, who was one of my great heroes, who see what's happening, but see themselves just ineluctably bound to the past. So you see this great bifurcation in German music, and then it sort of then you get this incredible outburst of talent around the First World War, where something new happens. Obviously Stravinsky, but also Debussy too. Something that's challenging this heretofore unchallenged German symphonic tradition, and it takes over, and you get two camps, which is exactly the situation I found in LA when I was growing up. The Schoenberg camp, and then the Stravinsky camp. And one of my he was never really so much a teacher, he was just a very great friend, Ingolf Dahl, was Stravinsky's, I guess you'd call him his secretary before Robert Kraft came on the scene. And he argued, and he was my principal teacher when I was getting my doctorate, certainly for the history and all the other classes. And he had a very different outlook, of course, than Schoenberg's, and it made me aware that there are other ways of writing music, and I found that very exciting. And in many ways, it appealed to me. I loved Schoenberg's technique, his incredible grasp of anything he wanted to do. But the guiding spirit behind it, this kind of overwhelmingly German, it's hard to describe this desire to encompass everything in music, and this Weltschmerz, culminating in Mahler, who I'm ashamed to say I have never probably appreciated the way I should. It led to something I didn't really like that much. And Stravinsky, and particularly Varese, who I think sort of took off from Stravinsky, this kind of very American kind of sound, a willingness to repeat things if they're really interesting and to make them interestingly complicated, and also to, of course, use percussion and new sounds and just try something new that music had never done before. So I found this very exciting, and there were these parallel paradigms, if you want, different, but you could do either of them really, and that's, I think, the way the music was when I was growing up. You would find Hindemith was also in the running too, and of course Bartok, I should have mentioned, who I also admired and imitated. So you had all of these still had a kind of, I would say they belonged to the dominant paradigm of 19th century music. Whatever you did was worked over. It wasn't enough to simply repeat stuff verbatim. Even with Varese, where you get a lot of that, you find subtle changes. So there's this idea of music as something which deserves and requires your unwavering attention. That's the big thing. You go to concerts, and that's all you do is listen to what you're hearing. Then there's this great revolution which comes from America, I think, rock and minimalism, and I'm, without disparaging them, I would say, to my thinking, they are sound that you can do something else to. Obviously dance in the case of rock, but also just multitask in the case of minimalism, and you can do a lot of other stuff while you listen to it, and it's kind of a pleasant background, and or maybe not so pleasant for people like me. So I think there is a real paradigmatic shift there, where young people, my students, and the other people on this concert of mine at Mexico City, pretty much are doing that. And it's as though whatever I do is just something kind of exotic or old-fashioned, and they might even like it, but it's nothing they would do. And I think we're witnessing that kind of a shift right now in music.
Well, it's nice that they're rediscovering you while you're still around to enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I realize what I want to do, and this is what I do, and there's probably room for both, and maybe music is very different from science. There is no one way of looking at nature. There is no one way of listening to music. There is probably basically one way of looking at nature at any time.
Right, well, we'd be remiss if we just didn't have a quick mention of your Innova 2 CD set called New Paths. Do you just want to encapsulate what that's about? Because that's a kind of synthesis of many of the things you've been talking about, is that right, over a period of time?
I'm sorry to interrupt. That, I think, says what I feel like now after a long life of composing music. I've been writing for at least 50 years, maybe 60 years. And I feel now whatever I want to do, I've achieved. And I was so pleased that you put it out, because these represent what I think are what I want to be remembered by, what I feel now. And basically, as I say in the notes, my idea of music is music. It's the form, and the music itself is generated by the sounds. It's based on sounds, not systems. When you go to the university and get your doctorate, you're inundated with systems, of course, Schenker, Fort, all these buzzwords, and they are valuable. But I think students don't realize enough that what really makes music now is what always made it great, from Josquin on. It's just simply a delight in sound. And a composer is a person who sees maybe more, or hears where that sound wants to go. So my thinking is that sound is a natural object. It's something with a life of its own, and your duty as a composer is to find out and state as succinctly as possible the outcome of that sound, where it should go, where you think it can go most eloquently.
Well, Larry Moss, it's a pleasure talking to you today, and thank you so much. It's wonderful listening to your music.
Well, thank you, Philip. I've enjoyed this.